Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen Center for Thought and Culture. I'm David DiCerto, Director of Programming Administration here. And on behalf of the Sheen Center, I'm just delighted that you all came out tonight on such a beautiful Friday evening to spend some time with us. It's our hope that you come out on many Friday evenings to spend some time with us and to find out about all the events we have, not only in talk, but in theater, music, and film. You can visit our website, which is sheencenter.org. Now, as a lowly graduate of Fordham University, I don't know if I'm qualified to introduce tonight's speaker, Father Wilson Miscamble. But I thought about it. It's fall, it's football season, and all those great alums of the Fighting Irish who made it into the NFL and were privileged to win a Super Bowl had to raise a trophy named after Vince Lombardi, a Fordham Ram. So perhaps the only thing more synonymous with Notre Dame than its storied gridiron greatness is its legendary president, Father Theodore Ted Hesburgh. And in his book, American Priest, The Ambitious Life and Conflicted Legacy of Notre Dame's Father Ted Hesburgh, Father Miscamble writes, quote, "The historian's task is not simply to burnish the image of a charismatic individual, but to examine a mortal life in its complexity. To do that for us tonight, we are honored to have Father Miscamble, who in addition to authoring this and other books, is an accomplished historian, held the chair of Notre Dame's history department from 1993 to 1998, and served as rector and superior of Moreau Seminary from 2000 to 2004. It is my distinct privilege to welcome to the podium Father Wilson Miscamble.
Up just a little. Well, thank you very much, David. Let me begin by thanking David and all of his team here at the Sheen Center for their gracious hospitality. And let me thank, it's rather dark there, so I can't see him, but I want to thank my agent and friend Bill Barry, who has worked with David in organizing for tonight's event. And I want to thank Bill at this time when he is present somewhere here for his willingness to help me get this book published in a good place, and I'm grateful for his guidance. Of course, I want to thank my two notable interlocutors tonight. You'll see more of them in a minute, Fran Mayer and Bill McGurn. Whatever they say about the book, I will still hold them in high regard. Whatever they say. And lastly, of course, I want to thank all of you. I wish I could see you a bit, but I cannot. I hope you can see me. I am grateful to each one of you for coming tonight. So I especially am grateful to have a distinguished congressman in the audience. Congressman King, thank you very much for your presence here. Your son and I have worked together on matters at Notre Dame, and it's a pleasure to meet you and to see you tonight. My biography of Father Hesburgh had a very long gestation period. I first raised to him my plans to write his biography in 1994. I interviewed him at length in 1998, and the book appeared just this past year. What can I say? I worked on other projects in the intervening time. I suppose I could say I'm rather slow, but I'd prefer to say I'm very measured in how I go about things. And of course, I wanted to write Father Ted's whole life, and he lived until 2015. Father Ted was born in Syracuse, New York on May 21st, 1917, and he died at Notre Dame on February 21st, 2015. So he lived a long life, almost 98 years, and it was not only a long life, but a very full life. he touched many lives in a very positive way over his 70 years as a priest. He was ordained in 1943 at the age of 26. I want to make sure that you understand his dedication as a priest. In telling Father Ted's story, I focused on two main areas: his leadership of Notre Dame, and then his service to the nation, the United States, and his church, which I described as his service to popes and presidents. Now, I want to, in my remarks here, to try and provide for you some sense of his main accomplishments, and also to give you a sense of my principal conclusions regarding him. Now, following his ordination, as I mentioned, in 1943, June of 1943, Father Hesburgh stopped by the east door of Sacred Heart Church and read the dedication above it. Those of you familiar with Sacred Heart Basilica at Notre Dame would know it well. God, country, and Notre Dame. He later recalled that right there, he committed his life to serving that Trinity. The contours of his story, revealed in my book, speak to the fidelity with which he kept that pledge. His remarkable life and notable contributions undoubtedly make him the most significant figure in the modern history of Notre Dame, and perhaps only his confrere and founder of the university, Father Sorin, and perhaps a football coach or two could rival him in significance and fame. Yet, David alluded a little to this in his introduction. When examining Hesburgh's portrait more closely, the sort of glowing picture portrayed in most general commentary about him, such as that which emerges from the remarkable Notre Dame publicity machine, and also as revealed in the recent documentary film, that sort of most general commentary is very much in a sort of positive, almost hagiographical sort. But if you move beyond that, I say the picture about him becomes more blurred, and the exact nature of his accomplishments more debatable. From the first moment that he became president, Father Ted insisted that if Notre Dame was to achieve excellence, it had to move beyond piety and hagiography in its intellectual pursuits. That's what he wanted for Notre Dame. And that is what he wanted for his biography, as he told me directly. My book is an effort to move beyond hagiography. It is a critical biography of Father Hesburgh, and it is what he said he wanted me to write. Hesburgh's contributions as priest, public servant, and university president clearly overlapped and impacted one another. But let me offer a few comments on each here. Firstly, on his service as a priest in the Congregation of Holy Cross, the order of which, of course, I am also a member. He always held his priesthood as the very center of his life. It was, as he described it, the ground of his being and inseparable from his identity. He surely did throughout his life what good priests have always done over the centuries. Proclaimed the word of God, preached about it with authenticity, ministered devoutly the sacraments, especially the Eucharist. He had a great devotion, of course, to the Mass. And he spoke words of forgiveness, consolation, compassion. My book makes this clear. And any suggestion that the book is a hit job on Father Hesburgh, as was recently suggested by Ken Woodward in a review in Commonweal, is total nonsense. Father Ted's renown, however, owed much more to his actions in the public sphere and to his leadership of his university than to any particular contribution within the Church. He played no significant role in Vatican II. His relations with the popes he served, aside from Paul VI, were rather limited. Ironically, his most consequential role was in helping lead the effort of American Catholic universities to distance themselves from ecclesial oversight. Through the combination of the transfer of Notre Dame's ownership from the Congregation of Holy Cross to a mixed board or shared governance arrangement, and then through the Land O'Lakes Statement, Father Ted effectively established his independence from church authority. This fraying in the formal relationship between Catholic universities like Notre Dame and the church that provided their raison d'etre reflected no desire on Father Ted's part to secularize his school. Rather, he wanted to make Notre Dame more consonant with and acceptable to the reigning approach in American higher education. Yet, this assimilationist tendency had consequences that he did not fully perceive. Father Hesburgh's influence proved much more noteworthy in his efforts to serve his nation. No other priest served so effectively in the public sphere over such a long period, spanning presidential administrations from Eisenhower's through to Clinton's. His involvements are all the more extraordinary in that he pursued them while actively leading his university. His role was not one of a sort of spiritual guide or religious counselor to American leaders, as in the manner of the Reverend Billy Graham, who was always being called in to pray with Nixon or Clinton when they were in big trouble. Rather, Father Ted toiled tirelessly to aid the United States to resolve some of the major issues and challenges it confronted during this whole tumultuous time. This was the approach he brought to the issue that has bedeviled the United States from its founding, how to provide justice for African Americans. His sustained commitment to secure civil and voting rights for African Americans who had suffered long years of shameful discrimination suffices in and of itself to win him a place of honor for his public service. Hesburgh's assignments to formal and consequential governmental roles largely ended with the arrival of the Reagan administration in Washington, D.C., but that did not mean he ended his efforts to influence national policies. Hesburgh's engagement in the public sphere had from early days been pursued through non-governmental agencies and institutions, as well as through formal presidential appointments. Yet, I argue, he became caught in the embrace of an increasingly secular liberal establishment, especially through his membership of the Rockefeller Foundation Board, which he chaired from 1977 onwards. Sadly, I argue, he influenced this establishment much less than the utilitarian establishment swayed or manipulated him. He was the accommodating and acceptable priest. The powerful grip of the establishment upon him is evidenced in his ambivalence regarding the extensive population control efforts supported by the Rockefellers. Membership of this establishment exacted a painful price because he tempered his commitment on key moral issues that attracted establishment disapproval, most notably opposition to abortion. He increasingly either reflected the liberal political and social agenda, or he sort of downplayed the areas where he dissented from it. Now, serving as president of Notre Dame was the position that Hesburgh deemed the biggest thing that I could possibly do in my life. He was an extraordinary institution builder who dramatically enhanced Notre Dame's size, its wealth, its reputation. He oversaw the major decisions to transfer ownership from the Congregation of Holy Cross to the Board of Fellows and to admit undergraduate women to the university. He set Notre Dame on the course to becoming a significant research university in the United States, and he had notable strengths, clearly remarkable strengths for leadership and in enlisting the aid of dedicated benefactors to support his mission. He also led Notre Dame in a modern direction, more in the mode of the reigning Harvard-Berkeley paradigm for American universities. This assimilationist instinct, however, sometimes led him to succumb to the pressures of conformity in the university's central academic domain. As a result, Notre Dame, sadly, like many more nominally Catholic institutions, gave up on a serious commitment to provide a distinctly Catholic education for its students, which would equip them spiritually and intellectually to confront an increasingly relativist world. Consequently, the majority of Notre Dame students are deprived of an education that would allow them to comprehend well the complementary nature of faith and reason, to receive a deep understanding and love for the truth, and to gain a solid comprehension of the Catholic social and moral vision. Let me add, a minority of our students who want to seek it out can still find that education at Notre Dame. I want to emphasize that point. But if you drift through, as many students do, through college, they can miss it, even at Notre Dame. The majority graduate without a sustained and serious engagement with the riches of the Catholic intellectual, literary, and artistic traditions. I hope, though, that they keep coming to events here at the Sheen Center. Over the 3 decades since Father Hesburgh left the presidency of Notre Dame, discussions and debates have ensued about the Catholic mission and identity of the university. Those who follow Notre Dame, and I realize the whole world does not, it tends to be a sort of self-selected group, but those who follow Notre Dame and the broader debates about Catholic higher education know that the Hesburgh legacy is a contested one. Was the price paid for enhanced academic prestige worth it? Is Notre Dame an instantiation of an institution that gained much in the world but lost at least some of its soul? How the Hesburgh legacy is viewed has clear implications for how the present and future are to be navigated at Notre Dame. Guided by his conscience, Father Hesburgh sought to serve his church, his nation, and his university according to his own lights. He contributed much in that endeavor, but there are sizable limitations to his record. This is the argument I have outlined in my book. Comprehending the full details of his life and work can provide valuable lessons for the present and the future as to what to do, and even more importantly, what not to do. I look forward to hearing what Bill and Fran might have to say about the book and the view of Father Hesburgh that it offers, and then to our conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, it's now my honor to welcome the first of our two equally distinguished guests, both graduates of Notre Dame. What a coincidence. Fran Mayer served as editor-in-chief of the National Catholic Register Newsweekly from 1978 to 1993 and has worked in senior church positions since that time. For the past 23 years, he served as a special assistant and senior advisor to Archbishop Charles Chaput, first in Denver and later in Philadelphia. His bylined work has appeared in the New York Times, Sunday Magazine, First Things, National Review, and other publications. I'm glad to say he is also a dear friend of the Sheen Center and has appeared here before. It is my honor to welcome Fran Mayer.
You know, what's interesting about Father Bill's comments, as I was sitting there, I was thinking how closely the experience of Father Hesburgh really is an example of the American experience in general, American Catholic experience in general. This issue of assimilation and bleaching out of one's Catholic identity is something that wasn't reserved to Father Hesburgh. I mean, all of the people in my generation, in a sense, have gone through that process and had to make decisions one way or the other as to whether we're going to be more Catholic or less, and therefore more professionally upwardly mobile. Anyway, though, I'll give you my prepared comments, and then we can chat later. I want to begin by saluting Father Miscamble for producing a biography that's exceptional on 4 different levels. It's very well written, it's very well researched, it's fair, and it's honest. All of those qualities are in short supply in our current public discourse and mass media, and also, frankly, within the Church herself. Like a lot of people my age, I read George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984 in high school, and there's a slogan of the ruling party in that book that I've never forgotten: ignorance is strength. Stupidity is powerful because it's simple and stubborn. When it's challenged, it can also be vindictive, and therefore it's always dangerous. A quick look at our politics is all the proof anyone needs. The point of a Catholic education is to lift us out of that animal state and provide us with the developed intellect and elevated moral character to live as fully human beings and make the world better by our presence. Father Ted Hesburgh continued tremendously to that task. He did it by building the University of Notre Dame into a world-class institution. I have friends and acquaintances on today's Notre Dame faculty, men like Jerry Bradley, Philip Munoz, Patrick Deneen, John Cavadini, Brad Gregory, Carter Sneed, and others, who are absolutely first-rank scholars by any standard, and they're also deeply Catholic in their convictions and their witness. Hesburgh helped make that possible. He set the school on the road to national and global prestige in higher education. And unlike so many Jesuit and other nominally Catholic institutions, the Catholic faith really does still play a significant role in Notre Dame's identity and daily life. The evidence for that, by the way, is that many of my fellow Domers still believe, with a kind of transcendent zeal, that the football team will win another national championship one of these decades. The point is, Ted Hesburgh lived a life that made a difference, a life that mattered. And I saw him do it. firsthand as a Notre Dame student, 1966 to 70. That's when my wife was at St. Mary's, and both of us, saw Father Ted Hesburgh as a leader up close and personal. And then in my years with the National Catholic Register, my problem with the memory of Father Hesburgh is that I always felt he mattered more and wanted to matter more to the world than to the church. That made him very effective, but also very selective in the issues he chose as his focus. Father Ted did wonderful work, really outstanding work, in areas like racial justice, war and peace, the Cambodian refugee crisis, and international dialogue. But he aligned very closely with the politics and allergies of the Democratic Party, and he was essentially a no-show on the abortion issue at a time when a forceful voice on behalf of unborn children from a person of his standing could have had a real impact. In a sense, he was worse than a no-show because he helped facilitate a famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, 1984 speech at Notre Dame by Governor Mario Cuomo. In his remarks, Cuomo argued that a Catholic political leader could legitimately separate his personal opposition to abortion from the way he imposed his beliefs on his public policy actions. The Cuomo talk had a huge effect because it sounded plausible on the surface and seemed to give Catholic public figures a good moral alibi to ignore Catholic teaching, not only on abortion, but a lot of other related issues. That speech has always been a source of special frustration in our family because of our son with Down syndrome and our grandchildren, 3 of them with special needs, who are exactly the kind of unborn children sacrificed to the mendacious reasoning that Cuomo advanced. In fact, I reread the Cuomo talk a couple of years ago, the talk Ted Hesburgh helped to facilitate, and I found it to be an embarrassment, something any competent high school debater could demolish. But the damage was done, and its consequences are still with us, far beyond the abortion issue, by the way. In fact, the speech was largely a fraud, in my opinion, because Cuomo's own logic didn't stop him from imposing his personal beliefs on the political system by vetoing the death penalty as New York's governor 12 times. Hesburgh was also instrumental in developing the Land of Lakes statement, which Father mentioned, that, as Father Miscamble correctly notes, effectively declared the independence of Catholic universities from official church authority. The complications caused by that statement for Catholic higher education and for any kind of unified Catholic intellectual witness in this country have been incalculable. In his book, Father Miscamble commits the sin, for some reviewers, of being insufficiently fulsome in his praise for Father Hesburgh. But telling the truth about anyone involves describing the whole person. Anything less is hagiography, which Hesburgh himself had little use for, unless, perhaps, when it applied to himself. He had many, many worthy qualities, but the virtue of humility is not part of his legend. In the end, Father Hesburgh was a decent, even an exceptional man who achieved some great things while dealing with the same ample warts, ambitions, and flaws decent men so often have. Canonizing him as a saint is above an honest biographer's pay grade. Father Miscamble is exactly that, an honest biographer with a respectful, convincing, engaging voice. So buy the book. It's worth every nickel. Thank you.
William McGurn is a member of the Wall Street Journal editorial board and writes the weekly Main Street column for the Journal each Tuesday. He spent more than a decade overseas, in Brussels for the Wall Street Journal Europe, and in Hong Kong with both the Asian Wall Street Journal and the Far Eastern Economic Review. Among his many other accomplishments, he previously served as chief speechwriter for President George W. Bush and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. It's my honor to welcome Mr. William McGurn.
Thank you. Like Fran, I'm an alumnus of Notre Dame, and again, like Fran, I was never a student of Father Miscamble's. Father would no doubt say that that is evident from my writing. When I asked Father what I should speak about tonight, he was very clear, about 2 minutes. And that is very wise advice. As a speechwriter, I'd say the Gettysburg Address was 271 words. The 10 Commandments fit on 2 tablets. And though I will match neither in eloquence, I will equal both in brevity. Some of what I say will parallel what Fran said. I graduated from Notre Dame in 1980. So Father Hesburgh was a huge presence in my life, not only as a student, but as an American, because it was the 70s were kind of the heyday of his public involvement, especially the Rockefeller Foundation. I was not always a fan, and I had a tussle with Father Ted when I was a freshman over the life issues. And to me, he sometimes seemed to adhere to that form of American Catholicism that decrees there is no salvation outside the Democratic Party. But I even interviewed him once for Fran for the National Catholic Register when I was working for him. But in reading this book, there's a famous saying, Oliver Cromwell, warts and all, when they painted his portrait. And I was very familiar with Father Ted's warts, very familiar. I followed his career. I followed developments at Notre Dame very closely. But in reading this book, I came away with a lot more appreciation for Father Ted's achievements, that some of which Father outlined there. And also, just as an American priest, Father went hunting with them and up in the cabin. I never did. I never saw Father Ted without his collar. I never saw any embarrassment that he was a priest. And over the years, Congressman King probably could say the same thing. You meet a lot of people that didn't share Father Ted's politics, but will tell you, my dad died and Father Ted was there all night with me, or something like that. I mean, he was a priest and a witness to people first. And I think that that comes through in the book. So I want to say I left the book feeling a lot more positive about Father Ted, even though I'm very opposite politically, and I was very aware of his issues on life. Father Miscamble is going to talk to you in more detail about his legacy, and especially on life. Fran mentioned his absence and so forth on the issue. He famously said, and I think this sums up a lot, it was an abortion conference, a population conference, right? There was a book about it called Abortion Parlay. Conference at Notre Dame in the 73 or 73, around that time. And Father Ted was quoted about the pro-lifers saying, and I think if you substituted the word Republicans, you would get what he means. These are people who agree with us on only 5% of the issues and are against us on 95%, by which I think he means liberal democratic agenda, minimum wage, and issues we can have disagreement on. Whereas he pointed out the Democrats agree with us on 95% of these issues, but disagree with this 5%. I think that explains a lot of the way he approached the issue, and I think a lot of the way it's approached today. No one would say that Father Hesburgh was indifferent on abortion or pro-choice. But he was missing, and I think he felt it was a Republican issue, as opposed to seeing abortion, especially in those early years, as a beachhead for an entire ethic of human life, that we now have transgender and assisted suicide and all these things, and that was the beachhead. And I think seeing it as that 5%, which is kind of a political view, was a problem. And I'd like Father at one point to ask, to flip the question, at the time, in the 1960s, the Democratic Party was still more pro-life than the Republican Party. The Republican was the old WASPy Planned Parenthood party. And Ted Kennedy was pro-life, I think, in as late as 1968. And so the question is, if priests and clerics who had influence on these people like Father Ted had used that influence in the same way he had used his influence on civil rights, might he have prevented the Democratic Party from going the way it's gone to now, where abortion on demand with no restrictions and federal funding is the position of every presidential candidate, I think. So it would be interesting to contemplate it, to use that. I know you want to hear about the the author himself. But the other thing I'd like to talk about is the tenor of the book. You know, when you read a biography, I've read a lot of biographies in my life of political leaders, of generals, and so forth. I mean, you expect it to be critical. When it's called a critical biography, it doesn't mean that it's every page is criticizing him. It just means that it's trying to fairly assess it. And that's what I came away. And I follow Notre Dame a lot. There was a lot I didn't know. And it underestimates Father Miscamble's skills, because not only is he by profession a historian who's written other biographies, he's a Holy Cross priest at Notre Dame who also knew Father Ted personally and had hours of taped conversations for this purpose. So I would say it would be hard to get any more ideal biographer to do Father Ted's life. Father Ted, as Father Miscamble alluded to, always strove for excellence, and he had little patience for pieties, and so he thought Catholic schools had to be able to engage the world critically the same way Harvard did or Princeton did. And as he mentioned, that would be the standard for his book. But that's not the way the book has been received by some people. Instead of engaging Father Miscamble and disagreeing with him based on evidence and reasoned argument, too many have attacked him for what seems to be the crime of daring to suggest that not everything Father Hesburgh did was wise or perfect. There's a reason Father Ted chose to talk to Father Bill, after all. I want to say something else about the vision at Notre Dame that also I think is a plus for Father Ted. I mean, the title of the book is American Priest, and Father Ted was a proud American. You know, years ago, I read a biography of Father Sorin by Father Miscamble's friend, Father O'Connell. And it's a tremendous biography. And for people who don't know, the founder of Notre Dame came from post-revolutionary France, and I think would be regarded as an ultra-reactionary in his upbringing in France and approach to piety. I think in the beginning he said he didn't think America could ever produce its own priests. It would have to rely on Europeans for priests and so forth because of quality. Over the years, he changed so much, and he became one of those great larger-than-life 19th century immigrants who are almost more American than others. There's a famous saying by Evelyn Waugh talking about the innocence of America and the cynicism of others, that he says, we're all born American, but we all die French. And it seems to me Father Sorin was just the opposite, and I think Father Hesburgh was just the opposite too. The confidence that he had, the faith in his country, and it does shine through in this book. So with that, I'll yield the floor so we can all hear more from the man of the hour. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you all again for being here. And as we're talking, we are going to give the audience a chance to ask some questions, so start making those notes. Father, I guess we'll start just by asking, having listened to Fran's and Bill's comments, is there anything that you want to respond to specifically?
Just picking up on the final point of Bill's about Father Hesburgh's deep love for the United States. The title American Priest is sort of a little bit of a play there, but it certainly reflects his deep patriotism and love for the United States and his desire to improve the United States led him into all these various outside engagements. He had, I think, 16 presidential appointments of one sort or another. And that love for America was just an enormous part of his life. With a little response to Fran's point about Father Hesburgh and his humility or lack thereof, in some ways he sort of came over time to fill out his own persona. He was in person the kind of public figure, and perhaps when he looked in the mirror, he saw Father Hesburgh going forth from Notre Dame to achieve various things, and he saw that he had to utilize that sort of public role that he had adopted as he saw it for good. But as Fran pointed out, as I tried to explain in the book, it was only certain issues that he gravitated towards. Bill also touched on this. I think just imagine if the stature and prestige he had worked up as such a figure in the civil rights effort had then been applied in the other great moral issue, the life questions, and particularly after Roe versus Wade abortion. If he had brought that to bear, I do think, Bill, that it would have had an impact. Now, I'm not saying that it would have changed the direction of the Democratic Party. There were forces at work there with the blow-up in '68 and the anti-war effort and the confusion in the Democratic Party, and then the McGovernization of the party in 1972, that I'm not sure Father Ted could have sort of redirected the whole direction. But I think he could have given more assistance and encouragement to Democratic politicians to hold the line, to stand forth. There were all these Catholic Democrats who folded like a deck of cards and simply became these pro-choice, the sort of Mario Cuomo, I'm personally opposed, but position. Hesburgh could have done, I think, some sterling work in stiffening the resolve of Catholic Democrats. And sadly, he backed away from that because I think he worried that it would put him on the outs with a lot of those establishment friends that he had made in the previous 2 decades.
Well, may I open this next question up to all three of you? You all three spoke obviously about Father Ted's many accomplishments and his rich legacy, like in the civil rights movement. But you said there was somewhat of a price that came along with assimilation and accommodation. So I guess I turn the question that you asked, was the prestige worth it? So if you three could just offer your thoughts about that, was the prestige worth it? And then a second follow-up, do you think, looking back, you interviewed Father Ted, almost 10 years after a lot of these events had happened, the Cuomo speech, even longer after the Land O'Lakes conference. Do you think he thought the prestige was worth it later in life, or do you ever get a sense that there were some regrets?
He certainly had no regrets about the Land O'Lakes statement. I interviewed him up at the university's property now at Land O'Lakes in northern Wisconsin, and he's extremely proud of the fact that the Civil Rights Commission met there and they finalized the draft of their first report, and just as proud that the Land O'Lakes gathering took place there and that the statement. Now, he was more sensitive about the criticism of the Land O'Lakes statement, because by the time I was interviewing him, David, he could look around the landscape and see the secularization that had taken place in so many Catholic schools. But of course, he always held, we've done so much better at Notre Dame, which is true, than, I think Fran made this point, than so many of the other major Catholic universities. I hope there are not too many Georgetown grads in the audience, but Georgetown is usually mentioned as the sort of counter that Notre Dame has held much more to its identity than has Georgetown, and Father Ted would put that forth, look what we've done. And he would argue that the critics are just sort of carping on. They don't realize that, you have to boost the excellence and reputation of the school, and you can't hold on to some of that, the old Thomistic synthesis, that sort of thing. So right, I think, to the end, he was still maintaining that he had pursued the right course. Not too many regrets. Occasionally, he would admit to me, how did that person get an appointment at Notre Dame or something like that? So he had some concerns about directions. I'm not saying he was totally naive about what was happening, but overall still remarkably convinced that he had taken the right steps. He was not given to great regrets or second thoughts.
Bill or Fran?
Yeah, I'll just give you some stats. The central question that Dave asked was whether it was worth it. Well, in Philadelphia is one of the flagship dioceses of the United States. We're down to 18% weekly practice. We have about 215 parishes, and we can sustain in the medium to long term about 140 of them. Nationally, the Catholic Church in the United States brings in, all told, through all of its charities, about $6 billion a year. 10 to 15 years from now, that'll be down to $1 billion a year. And the implications for social services, evangelization, buildings, ministries, that's just catastrophic. Now, you can't blame all that on my generation. I mean, you can blame a lot of it. And certainly a guy like Ted Hesburgh is an exemplar of it. But there are also many, many changes in the culture that no bishop and no priest could either anticipate or control. I mean, changes in technology, demography, legal theory. There's so many things that tsunami of change that happened after the Second World War that hit my generation in a particular way. I don't think anybody could have completely held the line against that. And then you compound that with the kind of social, psychological dislocation of the Vatican Council and the easy way of misinterpreting. When an ecumenical council happens, it can take 50 to 100 or more years for that to be fully digested by the church and her people. We went from being a Tridentine model, really guided by Thomistic philosophy and the Reformation, Counter-Reformation, to this kind of open the windows to the world, and that just is a chemistry for chaos, which is exactly what happened. So there was just an enormous number of things have happened in the life that Sue and I have shared as a married couple that were completely inconceivable to our parents. Into that, you add the impulse to assimilate that comes naturally from an immigrant church, and the desire to succeed and prove that you're worthy of being in this country, and you've got a really toxic environment. And so at the end of it all, I just gave you the stats a moment ago about where we are. I don't think that's all bad, by the way, because at the end of the day, it's forcing Catholics who really believe to say, you know what, I really do believe, and there's a cost associated with that, and I have to make sacrifices in order to sustain the church that I claim to believe. It's Christ's church, it's not our church. Finally, the church is guaranteed survival. It's just going to be a rough road for the Catholic Church in this country over the next 25 to 50 years, and you can't blame all of that on Ted Hesburgh, but he did play a significant role in some elements of the process.
When you were asking the question, was it worth it, I was thinking of that scene in A Man for All Seasons when Thomas More is sitting there, and they hadn't been able to pin it on him until Richard Rich perjured himself. And in exchange for his perjury, he became Attorney General of Wales. And of course, More says to him, Richard, it doth not profit a man to gain the world and lose his soul, but for Wales. And that's more than just a flip comment for me. Our daughter is also a student at Notre Dame. And Fran mentioned before, there are some fabulous professors out there, and there's some really beautiful things here, but I wonder if her child is going to have that same opportunity. And Notre Dame's going to be even richer when my grandchildren get around, but I wonder if they're going to be richer in spirit. I say one thing, from down here, my father's generation. My father went to Xavier High School. He's a poor kid from Brooklyn. His classmate was Antonin Scalia, okay? And both of them, their understanding of the faith was grounded in their high school experiences, right? They can defend the faith and so forth. How many Notre Dame students, forget about agreeing with the faith, can even state clearly what the faith is, what we mean, and especially at this time in our country, when I think people are very lonely, I think they're really being misled, and they really need the church's witness on issues like sexuality and marriage and happiness. Our Notre Dame people, I think Father Ted wanted us to be able to leave in society as educated Catholic men and women. And the irony is, again, going back, it seems to me that Notre Dame graduates people that may be pious. They go to church, they go to the grotto, but I'm not sure they're educated. At least I'm very sure they're not educated in the faith, in the ability to express what is it that makes the Catholic Church and our proposition about the world different from the rest of the world.
Yeah, I would say that the possibility of that kind of education is there at Notre Dame for those who seek it out, but it's not provided for the majority of students.
And
Yeah,
I think
leads-
one other observation too, one of the things that my boss reminds me about all the time is the function that history plays for a community, that memory plays for the individual person. You know, if you forget who you are, you're nobody, and anybody can tell you who you were and what you should be doing. And it works exactly the same way in a community. If you don't understand your own history and have a really accurate grasp of it, you're nowhere. And I think one of the major contributions of this book is to add to an accurate understanding of the Catholic experience in the last century. And Father Miscamble has done a superb job of that. I mean, if you read this book, you're going to understand some of the trends and developments inside the church and outside the church that, you know, if you watch television all day long, it should not even going to occur to you to ask. I mean, but who you are is in large part who you were. And I think what I enjoyed about Father Miscamble's book was this kind of experience of, oh yeah, I remember that. I remember this explains why we're where we are. It's a real positive value to the book that I don't want it, and I don't want to miss the opportunity to point that out.
Yeah. Last June, America magazine ran an article with the provocative question that is Catholic identity hurting enrollment at Catholic colleges? And they certainly were not supporting that thesis. They think they were just asking with the idea that the rising costs of just maintaining a Catholic university and the increasingly secular pool of students applying is making maintaining that Catholic identity more and more difficult. If I could ask you to conjecture for a moment, what do you think Father Ted's answer to that question would be? And so it's open to anybody.
Yes, you're mentioning, David, that America article brings to my mind, I won't name the college where this was taking place, but I was told by a family who had their child touring a number of Catholic schools, and they were on a campus, and someone said, well, is the place Catholic? And the tour guide, who was like a junior or a senior on campus, said, yes, but it won't bother. It doesn't bother us at all that the place is Catholic. I would hope that no tour guide at Notre Dame would say that. Hesburgh was maintaining right to the end that he was about building a great Catholic university. And he certainly helped maintain a sort of a rich Catholic presence at Notre Dame in terms of the liturgical life and the chapels and masses readily available, et cetera, Where I argue he was less successful was focusing on these two crucial questions: what is taught and who teaches? Who is hired? Are they supportive of the mission? Will they engage and teach out of a sort of framework where at least they are supportive of the broad mission of the school? And too many mistakes have been made in that area. Now, the argument of the America article, I know America wasn't endorsing it, but the argument was, in this highly secular age, if you emphasize Catholic identity and include some Catholic dimensions to student life so that it's not just a free-for-all as people live in dorms and so on, live a sort of semi-hedonistic kind of lifestyle, if you push that, it might turn people away. Well, if that's the case, don't maintain yourself as a Catholic school, is my view. If you haven't got the courage of your convictions to stand as a genuinely Catholic school, then I would prefer places secularized and forget the maintaining some sort of facade.
I would answer it two ways. The first way is I've kind of reached the conclusion that the kind of great university, Catholic university today in America is not possible. And it's more a bigness question, because the bigger your university gets, the less invested each member is in the mission. And once you get into professional schools and so forth, I think that just the fact of having to hire, especially when the culture is so hostile to this, the pool is smaller, I think it's very hard to maintain that on a large scale, which is why I think we see that the universities or the ones that are really maintaining their Catholic identity are smaller liberal arts colleges, because I think the smallness means there's more of a community and they're able to do it. I just think it's very hard to have the hiring and meet the demands of a modern university and maintain it. In theory, it may be, but I think the bigness has a big part of it. The other side, I'd say, is I think it can turn off kids. I mean, I know at my girls' high school, people say, oh, it's strict, bunch of none, no one wants to go there. But it's a very loving place. My view is always, you have to campaign on your differences, not your similarities. If you're saying, I am Iowa State, or I'm Harvard, then why don't people go to Harvard or Iowa State? You have to campaign on your differences. Julie and I lived in Hong Kong. I lived there 10 years, and I used to go to the school fairs representing Notre Dame sometime. And one time there was a person from St. Mary's, and they were trying to present St. Mary's as kind of a Notre Dame big school here. I said, you should campaign on, you're a small liberal arts school with a protected environment, and you're giving a good education. You know how many people, if they're going to send their daughter 15,000 miles across, they want that. Campaign on what makes you different. I think that's just a general sales pitch. And I don't think a lot of these schools that are really making their Catholic identity their priority are suffering from it. I think that they're able to attract people. Again, I think that's a harder task to do on a bigger scale, but I think we have a lot of small places that can do it.
We have 11 nominally Catholic universities and colleges within the bounds of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, and 15 years from now, there will be 2.
Wow. You know, I think we have to talk a little bit. I think it was Chesterton who said that education is truth in transmission. It's the society passing its soul from one generation to the next. And that's also echoed a lot in, John Paul II's Ex Cordia Ecclesia. Yeah. You touch on that in the book. Can you unpack that a little bit? And, Father Hesburgh's certainly in many ways endorsed it, but there was also a difference of opinion in how that's, I guess, implemented.
He resisted Ex Cordia Ecclesiae in the various stages of its drafting. They were being distributed. And the aspect, David, that he particularly resisted was the idea that there might be any ecclesial oversight of the institutions. And in particular, he was being advised by his friend, Father Richard McBrien, a quite liberal theologian, the idea that the theologians teaching in the theology department at a Catholic university should be required to gain a mandate from the local ordinary testifying that they could teach Catholic theology. Now, this was occurring while Notre Dame and every other school was conforming to regulations from the North Central Accrediting Agency, from the NCAA. There were rules and regulations galore that we wanted to tick the box and get the approvals, etc. But on this matter, Father Ted thought, if the church, which he began to sort of see as like an outside body coming in to try and impose. I point to the contradiction in the book. He wanted to say Notre Dame and Catholic universities would be the place where the church does its thinking, yet he didn't want any formal ecclesial connection between the church and the university. Of course, Ex Corde Ecclesiae says, from the heart of the church emerges the Catholic University. It was just a completely different approach. Now, Father Ted was so caught up with those more structural issues that he didn't pay, in my view, enough attention to the matter of the truth and how it is conveyed to the next generation. And I would say that's a significant failure on his part. But he was out to try and block Ex Corde at every step along the way.
Okay, I just got a couple more questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. One of my favorite writers, J.R. Tolkien, who also knew the faith and the sometimes frustrating life of academia, was critical of biographies because he said that a biography can sometimes get all the facts right, but not really cut to the truth of who a person is.
Yes.
So I ask all of you if you could, in a very succinct way, tell us who you think the truth of Father Hesburgh was.
I would say Tolkien is correct that it is difficult for a biographer to get at the truth of a person, because ask yourself how we all have a sort of interior life that we're never going to make sort of publicly fully evident. But looking at a long life in its totality, I think a good biographer can reveal much of the truth. So I'm not claiming that I provided the full truth about Father Hesburgh in this book, but I would suggest that I've been able to capture some of it. And the some is his enormous self-confidence and self-belief led him to think that he could make a notable contribution across the three areas that I pointed out at the outset. He thought he could contribute in the church, he thought he could contribute in his nation, and he certainly believed, he had just this enormous belief that he was sort of called or destined to make Notre Dame this great modern Catholic university. And so I put ambitious life. He's driven by an ambition to accomplish across those three areas.
Fran?
I think he's the perfect icon of the American Catholic experience in the 20th century. I can't think of a single person who represents the good and the bad of that better than Ted Hesburgh.
I would agree. I think it's captured again in American Priest, that the full dimensions of this, again, I recommend people buy the book and read it, because as I say, a lot of people reading this, I'm surprised at some of these criticisms of Father Ted in the warts and all. I mean, I was very familiar with the warts. I wasn't as familiar with the all. And it's hard not to read it and just admire, apart from the politics, just what he did, because you mentioned the other the cast of characters, all the people working for him and so forth. So it really does flesh out the life of an American priest who never had doubts about his priesthood and never had doubts about America.
Well, at least as far as the positives go, we here like to think the icon is Fulton Sheen, but we'll...
He's a pretty good guy, too.
Sort of rapid fire. I mean, there's so many points that we could talk about, but if you could just sort of top of mind what you think the high point or the low point of Father Hesburgh's legacy is, what would you say? I guess start with you, Father.
So I'll start with low point first. I think he conceded too much in gaining his presence in the establishment, and this led him to be less committed on some of the great moral questions. We've touched on it already. But high point, I would say, Bill has touched on it, this is from my perspective as a priest, is his devotion as a priest. The saying Mass every day, his deep love for the Eucharist, his willingness to try and assist people where he could. I could have filled a book with 10,000 stories of episodes of kindness that he did for individuals. So I included a couple of instances of kindness that he did for folks, one Father O'Connell, who's later sort of something of a critic of his. So I put his commitment as a priest as the high point above and beyond all of his great institution building at Notre Dame.
Fran?
Yeah, I think for me, the fact that he took the school from this kind of ethnic immigrant, football school and turned it into a significant Catholic university, that's his high point probably. His low point is, I think, the instinctive derision he had for what he would say are conservative causes in Catholics. I said it in my comments, those are issues that are visceral for a whole lot of Catholics. And he had a certain Clintonian, basket of deplorables thing going on that I don't have any respect for at all. That's his low point.
I'll try to make them personal with examples. I think the high point, the kind of thing that Father's talking about, I'm not sure if this anecdote's in your book, but I know you know about it. One of my professors, Ralph McInerney, a philosophy professor, who really did embody all that is good and true in Notre Dame, philosophy professor, Catholic identity, friendly with Father Hesburgh, but definitely on the other side on a lot of issues. When he was a young professor, he told me, and he had a bunch of kids. I don't know how many he eventually had, 8 or 9 kids. When he was young, just starting out, he had 3 or 4 kids or 5 kids, and they were looking for a house, and they couldn't afford it. He's a professor with all these kids, and Father Ted said, you buy the house. Buy the house. We'll take care of it. And I remember Ralph telling me near the end of his life, a man never forgets something like that, right? For all his criticisms of Father Ted, he was there for him. That would be the high point. The low point was more personal. I was a freshman at Notre Dame, and I wrote, Father Ted had the reputation of being always open to the students. He had his office in the Dome building, and if you saw the light going on, if you came up to him, through the fire escape, he'd invite you in for a beer and all this. So if you came up there...
Not for a beer. He'd invite you in for conversation.
Conversation. But it was always like, if you came and said, gee, Father, I'm kind of thinking of blowing up the ROTC building. Come on, Bill, sit down. That was not my experience. I wrote him a letter, very earnest. It was my freshman year, so I was 17. And I wrote about abortion and basically said, why don't you devote your attention to abortion the way you do like rent control or something. I'd be very embarrassed by this letter today because it's very earnest, full of references to limbo and so forth. But it was not insulting. It was not insulting. It was asking him a question. Well, I didn't get the, Father Hesburgh says, come on in, Bill, let's have a conversation. I got a nasty letter from him saying, I do care about this, I do speak out, but that's not good enough for people like you who want to run. I was 17 years old. And that, I think, spoke not only that he wasn't there, it spoke to 2 things, what Fran mentioned, the deplorables, and also that he was touchy about it. I think he realized it was a failing, and he was touchy. He's basically beating up on a 17-year-old kid, and I was scared. I was a freshman. I thought, oh, my God, I've got the president of the university angry with me. So those would be the 2 kind of boxes on Father Ted. He was there for Ralph McInerney when he needed it, and kind of not there for me. And I'm used to editors who are pretty fierce. So.
I do mention the Ralph McInerney instance. It came after the death of Ralph and Connie's son, Michael, and it was a matter that touched Ralph deeply, and whatever his later disagreements with Father Ted. I didn't interview Bill McGurn for the book, so I haven't got the Bill McGurn episode in there.
Well, in reading the book, as I told you upstairs, I think it's wonderfully written and very balanced and fair. We've done a great job at canvassing some of his shortcomings, but you also do a wonderful job at praising him when deserved. And if you could just speak really briefly, I know you dedicate a lot of the book to it, about the work he did do. I mean, obviously, race is a lingering question in our country. A lot of pain out there. So if you could just talk a little bit about Father Hesburgh's work with the civil rights movement.
Yeah. Father Ted had been focused on building up Notre Dame through the 1950s, had received an appointment to the National Science Foundation, was heavily engaged there, and out of the blue he gets called by Sherman Adams, who was Eisenhower's chief of staff, asking him would he serve on the Civil Rights Commission. And he clarified that he was an independent, and there was going to be three Republicans, 3 Democrats. They said, yes, you'll count, etc., and he took up the appointment. And I think it was, in many ways, an extraordinary, almost not exactly a life-changing appointment, but it shifted his focus very much to the great national issue of the moment. So from 57 through to 72, when the Nixon administration fired him, he was by that point chair of the Civil Rights Commission. By the way, it had a reasonable relationship with Nixon, at least in the initial stages. Hesburgh is deeply involved, David, in this civil rights campaign and comes to know a lot of the civil rights leaders, and he sees that this is the necessary cause for the United States to live up to its foundational charter. All are created equal. And he put enormous effort into it. It took him to all kinds of hearings throughout the South in those late 50s, early 60s period. His great admiration for Lyndon Johnson, he knew LBJ was a rather coarse individual, etc., but he saw that Johnson had been the one who pushed through the Civil Rights Bill in 64, the Voting Rights Act in 65, and he was always rather tempered in his regard for the Kennedys because he thought they were putting their political interests over civil rights and that LBJ laid it on the line. So civil rights, I think, is Hesburgh's greatest sort of public achievement. You know, his greatest contribution to the good of the United States lies in that area.
It's, as it's been said, it's just sad that that same moral courage wasn't exhibited in other great moral questions of the day. Okay, so we're going to turn on the lights now. If the house could just turn on some lights. And while that's happening, if I could just ask one question that I was curious about. In the opening of your book, you recount the story of when you first proposed the idea of writing the biography.
Yes.
And there was some hesitancy at first on Father Hesburgh's part, not doubting your writing ability, but just...
No, he did.
He did. But since this journey has taken you decades, and the finished project, was published after his passing, what do you think Father Hesburgh would have thought of the final product?
Yeah, that's a good question, David. When I first went to see Father Ted, this is classic Father Hesburgh, and speaks to his sort of the humility question. I said to him, Father Ted, I'd like to write your biography. And he goes, oh, how could any one person capture all that I have done? There's so many feet of papers on the Civil Rights Commission. There's so many on this. There's so many on that. Now, of course, knowing him as I do, I, of course, said, yes, I understand, Father Ted, but, remember, biographers have written about really major figures like FDR and Churchill, and he was like, oh, crap, I'm dealing with Miscamble. But he really wanted Father Marvin O'Connell. Bill referenced his biography of Father Sorin, and Hesburgh admired that biography, and he thought, Marvin has done Sorin, now he should do me. And in fact, Marvin gave it a bit of thought. I think Father Ted proposed to him once, look, do a book on all the presidents of Notre Dame. So there's Sorin at the outset. Oh, there are a bunch of nobodies in between. And then there's me. And O'Connell did give it that some thought. But I'm not sure how he would react to the book that we have. I think he would say to me, look, you just don't understand what I was trying to do in my opposition to ex corde, and you're too harsh on me for my involvement on the pro-life issue. I think he would say, look, I was always pro-life. It's just that I had a range of other issues that I had to pay attention to. So I think he would be a bit defensive about the critical tone of parts of the book. But I think he would, if he stood back, say, I know you've written an honest book, and I'm appreciative of your having a crack at trying to capture the major parts. I think he would at least say, you've touched on all the major parts of my life.
Okay, now it's your turn. Raise your hand, and all I ask is if you have a question, that you frame it in a question. We'll start with the gentleman in the blue shirt right there. Could you just stand up, please, sir?
How much was Father Hesburgh intertwined in the relationship with Cardinal Bernardine and Solowinski?
Yes.
Starting out with an easy one.
Yeah. He knew Saul Alinsky a little through another association, a great Chicago priest who worked at Notre Dame. He was much closer to Cardinal Bernardine, whom he knew when Cardinal Bernardine was the secretary of the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, and then Bernardine went, I believe, to Cincinnati and then to Chicago. And those of you who know Notre Dame know we're in South Bend, but Chicago is our really big city, and there's so much of the Chicago Catholic establishment that's linked in to Notre Dame. And Bernardine was chairing the bishops' committee that wrote the letter, the challenge of peace, God's promise and our response, on the war-peace issue, the nuclear issue. And Father Ted had made the nuclear issue his great concern. He wanted to establish the Peace Institute at Notre Dame, etc. So he admired Bernardine and wanted to work closely with the committee, etc. So a very close relationship with Bernardine. I know there's been some sort of chat in the internet world about the Saul Alinsky connection, etc. I don't think it was a deep connection to Notre Dame, but some folks have argued that, in the background that there was more of a connection. I just didn't discover it in my own work, but very close to Bernardine. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Mr. McGurn, I'm just curious, after that nasty letter to a 17-year-old, did you have any, over the years in college and afterwards, any personal
I did. I saw him.
with him?
I saw him several times. I never brought it up. And one time I saw him in the log chapel and talked to him, and it was when he was older, and I could see his brain, McGurn, trying to think of something. And I tried
He
to
did
get
have
out,
a tremendous memory for
Right.
names.
and I tried to get out of there before he realized who. One thing I do want to add to Father's point, a legacy that does continue on the life issue. No one would argue Father Ted was pro-choice, but in his choice of giving Mario Cuomo a platform, what he did many times, and it continued with the honorary degree to Barack Obama. I don't actually mind people going to Notre Dame and speaking if they're pro-choice. It doesn't bother me. But I want him to be challenged, but I don't want him to be honored. And he did that, and it seems to me sometimes that Notre Dame's public witness is about cleansing pro-choice politicians, because Father Ted would never, ever honor someone who was bad on civil rights or something. That would be considered disqualifying. And then to put it another way, people that watch the football games, every football game you see this ad, the Fighting Irish. I'm at Notre Dame. I fight for this. Children with handicaps and so forth. There's never been one in all these years. Imagine the witness in Notre Dame. I'm a Notre Dame student. I fight for the unborn. Just hasn't happened, and there's a reason for that. Never happened. Right?
It might displease NBC.
Yes.
I actually want to ask specifically about Obama coming. I'm not a Notre Dame graduate. I went to a college that was founded explicitly as a refutation to Land O'Lakes. But I was.
But a lot of those people were Notre Dame trained,
Yes,
Emily.
yes,
You just keep
all
that
right.
in mind. You just keep that in mind.
Back in earnings. But I was there for a summer as an Erasmus Fellow studying theology with great John Cavadini, Joe Warrico, and I went to talk to Father Hesburgh because he was a friend of my father's, and he said, "How are you enjoying your time?" And I said, "It's wonderful, Greg. Gregory's great, all these wonderful faculty members." And he said, "Are you going to come and do your graduate work here?" And I answered him very honestly. Obama had been there a month ago, and I said, "I'm very conflicted about it, honestly. I'm interested in Aquinas. You have wonderful Thomas here, but I've got to tell you, my Irish grandmother is misled by the witness Notre Dame just gave, and she is a Irish immigrant who looks to Notre Dame as the exemplar, the paradigm, the platonic form of what the American Catholic ought to be."
The platonic form. I should have used that, Emily. I should have used that.
And honoring President Obama, who has made no secret of how radically pro-choice he is, seems to me a betrayal of Notre Dame's Catholic identity. And very quickly, I had the experience that Bill McGurn had. Very quickly, the conversation and the personality switched, and he said, "You wait and see." He wagged his finger at me. "You wait and see. Notre Dame will influence him way more than he'll influence Notre Dame. You wait and see how much." And then the conversation was over. And I wish he had lived to see the HHS mandate.
Yeah, well, that's the conceit that we have always maintained. Somehow or other, we're going to influence them, but it never happens. You would think for people in the pursuit of sort of knowledge and truth that we might wake up to it after some period of time. Father Ted was locked in this just deep sense that his work in civil rights was being fulfilled because an African American had been elected president of the United States, and he saw this as such an accomplishment for the country. He could not look at the content of what President Obama was proposing in his legislation. It was just an enormous blind spot. Plus, he knew well, cagey guy that he was, that when Obama came, he was going to praise Father Hesburgh to the hilt, which of course he did to, great ovation, etc., etc. So I'm glad you had the conversation with him, Emily. It was a learning experience for you.
You talk about it in the book, but did he ever express a kind of regret? Did he anticipate the kind of pushback he got from some of the faculty and the students on that?
He certainly didn't express any regret about Obama being invited to Notre Dame. I think he was surprised by the extent of the public criticism of Notre Dame, not simply on campus, where, let's face it, I was part of the effort protesting, but it was modest. It was modest, although those undergraduate students were so terrific. What he was surprised by was 80 bishops coming out publicly and criticizing Notre Dame, and it sort of rocked the image of Notre Dame as this Catholic place. And I think it caused lasting damage to our image. It's the thing that our present president, John Jenkins, is most remembered for. His whole presidency is sort of characterized a bit by that invitation, sadly.
Just to build on that, we were part of the demonstrating the pro-life demonstration that was opposing Obama coming, and the school prosecuted the women in our Project Rachel and our pro-life 40 Days for Women. They prosecuted them, so that the school continued to prosecute them.
Yeah, Emily, just one denouement. I wasn't there that day, but it was a sad day for pro-life alums like myself. But the protest that Father was at was extraordinary. The bishop came, a friend of ours who had been pregnant as a senior at Notre Dame, and her boyfriend said, "I'll drive you to Chicago, get abortion." She was there with her 10-year-old daughter. Father Bill was there. So on the worst day, there was a great witness. And if you watch, I think you could still watch it on the internet. If you watch that, so the worst thing, it was small, but it was really inspiring to see some of the faculty stand up, including, and Father Bill was at the, I think you were head of faculty for life, was at the head of it there.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. So, the gentleman in the back.
Land O'Lakes, usually independence declarations need to be acceded to by the authorities or ineffectually resisted to be successful, right? So with Land O'Lakes, the bishops, I guess that's the ecclesiastical authority, why didn't they fight hard? Why didn't they stop it? And my follow-on to that is, if it was ineffectual or they acceded to it, is that because Hesburgh wasn't really leading something? He was more going along with where the church was going, the secularization that we've seen over the last 50 years, and really just following the trend that would have happened, that was happening everywhere.
Yes, perhaps you're right that there were certain trends that were already at work. And I would say there was a sort of larger challenge of authority of all sorts that was going on in those late 60s years, 67, 68, 69. And so the bishops in the United States, they get caught up in Fran can speak perhaps more knowledgeably than I can on this, but they're caught up in so many issues. Humanae Vitae comes out the following year. There's Charlie Curran and major protests on the Catholic University of America campus and so on. That was the bishop's own, supposedly own university, and they've got turmoil there. So I think they had so much on their agenda, they weren't capable, in a way, of trying to reel in or reestablish authority at universities like Notre Dame. So the Declaration of Independence pretty much went through. The bishops could play tough. You could withdraw faculties from priests or something like that on campuses. But none of them wanted to go down that path because Father Hesburgh all the time was assuring folks this is going to make us a more American university, but we'll still be a great Catholic university. So people weren't sure as Land O'Lakes got underway what all the consequences that would come from it.
Remember, too, that this happened shortly after the council closed. And it was easy at that time, still is easy actually, to throw the long ball to the documents in the council and say, well, this is just what the council said we should be doing.
In the spirit of
Yeah, and so a lot of bishops, and keep in mind too, and look, I worked for a bishop for 23 years and I love him. I really love him. I love him more now than when I actually went to work for him. Bishops are good men, but as a corporate body, you'll never get anything close to initiative out of them. It just is very, very difficult to get a collegial statement or a collegial response to something like the Land O'Lakes statement. They'll kick it upstairs to Rome, which will then take 5 years to get an answer, or they'll simply try to ignore it. It just doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way. The bishops don't operate that way.
You said that he didn't see the consequences that would come from this. How can you explain how farsighted he was on many topics, but so short-sighted on that one?
I think he was so invested himself in gaining independence for himself that he simply thought, I'll be able to handle whatever comes along. And the story of secularization in Catholic schools is never really one day a decision is made, we're going to secularize. It's appointment by appointment, it's decision by decision, and over time, the complexion of the faculty changes, the content of the curriculum changes, And Father Ted took his eye off those particular balls. He wasn't all that concerned. Those were sort of delegated to other folks. He was into the fundraising, the construction, the benefactor relationships, and so on. And so I think he had the very confidence that allowed him to be a visionary in some areas, led him to be confused about what might happen with Land O'Lakes.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Was there? Yes.
Okay, I guess we've been talking a lot about Father Ted's legacy, what he's the good, the bad, the decidedly ugly. I guess, is there something that we can learn from this ambitious life, this ambitious figure, as we sort of try and right some of the wrongs or strengthen some of the gains, let's say? Is there something that we can draw from Father Ted as we move forward to maybe stop 3/4 of the Catholic universities closing within Philadelphia?
Yeah. Well, that's an important question. I make no bones about the fact that I wrote this book with contemporary concerns in mind. I want to learn from his experience how we might do things in light of the strengths of his effort, but also in light of the limitations that have become obvious. I end the book with this sentence: comprehending the full details of his life and work can provide valuable lessons for the present and the future as to what to do, and even more importantly, what not to do. Perhaps a new generation of courageous educators in the faith might draw from the story of Theodore Martin Hesburgh an even better way to serve God, country, and Notre Dame. So I would argue, with regard to Notre Dame, the two questions that have to be faced by the people who are there: who teaches and what is taught? Can we maintain our distinctive identity as a Catholic university? Now, sometimes I'm not a person given to being depressed, but sometimes you get a little down about some latest decision. I mean, this, say, going back to Obama, you just go, what the heck? But every now and again, I know Our Lady still loves her university, because we still have some good faculty coming to Notre Dame who believe in the place and who can really help shape it. And every now and again, someone leaves the place and you go, thank you, Lord, thank you. You want them to go to some fine Ivy League school where they can really feel comfortable there, etc. So the challenge is for Notre Dame to recruit students who want to come to get a distinctive. And this is all very complicated, we know, because parents want to make sure that they go to a highly ranked school where they'll graduate and do well, et cetera, But we have to emphasize, this goes back to an earlier point that Bill made about emphasizing our distinctiveness, our difference. We have to be the great Catholic university in the United States and indeed in the world. That's our great challenge. And Father Hesburgh has given us, if you will, some of the material structure to do it. Now we have to do better what goes on within the classroom, within the buildings that are on the campus. We're good. We're good at raising money. We're good at building buildings. We have to do a better job at what goes on inside those buildings.
Well, thank you for that. Fran and Bill, any final thoughts about maybe a path forward for Catholic education to build on what Father said?
Yeah, Mao has this great essay called Protracted Conflict, and the reason I'm raising it is we have to think in long term about changing things. It's a long process. Perfect example of what Father said, different environment. John Garvey, who's president of Catholic University of America, used to be, dean of the law school at Boston College. And he's a straight shooter. The guy is very theologically sound. He said it took him 18 years of paying attention to every single faculty appointment, being engaged in it and overseeing it. And in 18 years, he turned the entire school around in terms of the Catholic substance of that particular law school. That's how long it takes, and that's the kind of time horizon that you need in order to really change an institution.
I would say it goes back to the fundamental question. It seems to me, Father says that one of the shortfalls of Father Ted was he wanted the establishment approval. I also have the sense that too much of his emphasis was on politics, and he basically assumed a Catholic character and assumed that would stay. And I think, again, Congressman King's a Republican. I think he would like it if there were pro-life Democrats. I think his life would be a lot easier, and America would be healthier. I don't want everyone to vote to have pro-life Democrats. And I think that people graduate from the school without a grounding in what we are, what makes us different, and what is our gift to the United States. And remember, if you go uptown, the seal on the official Harvard seal says for Christ and church. You go up to the Harvard Club, you'll see it all over the place. And they've lost that. And the only hope is our Catholic schools. I think the only practical hope of doing it. And Notre Dame could be a tremendous witness. It's partly a witness. But if you look at the resources it has, it's not nearly a witness in proportion to its resources the way some of these smaller schools are and so forth. And that's the hope, I think.
Well, I got to get one Fulton Sheen quote in, and Fulton Sheen, in speaking about higher education and its role of lifting students, hopefully out of ignorance, said that the only hope for higher education is a return to the idea that ignorance is not as bad as error. Thank you all for being here. Father, thank you for the witness of your writing. Thank you, Fran. Thank you, Bill, and thank you for being here tonight. And again, sheencenter.org. I hope to see you many more times in the season. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much.